Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Swamp, the Everglades, Florida, and the Politics of Paradise by Michael Grunwald. Narrated by Adam Verner. And God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Nature is overrated, but we'll miss it when it's gone. Florida golfers in the 2002 film Sunshine State. Introduction. A Treasure for Our Country. On December 11, 2000, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in George W. Bush and others, v. Albert Gore, Jr. and others. The partisan battle royale that would end the stalemate over the Florida recount and send one of the litigants to the White House. The deadlocked election had exposed a divided nation, and pundits were describing Governor Bush's Red America and Vice President Gore's Blue America as if they were separate countries at war. After 5 weeks of ferocious wrangling over pregnant chads and hanging chads, hardliners in both camps were warning of an illegitimate presidency, a constitutional crisis, a bloodless coup. Inside the court's marble and mahogany chambers, Senator Robert Smith of New Hampshire watched the legal jousting with genuine awe. Smith was one of the hardest of Red America's hardliners, a passionate anti-abortion, anti-gay, anti-tax Republican, and he believed he was watching a struggle for the soul of his country. Smith was also a former small-town civics teacher, less jaded than most of his colleagues in Congress, and Bush v. Gore was a civics lesson for the ages, a courtroom drama that would decide the leader of the free world. It doesn't get any bigger than this, he thought. But less than an hour into the proceedings, Smith suddenly walked out on history, squeezing his 6'5", 280-pound frame past his perplexed seatmates. "Excuse me," he whispered. "Excuse me." A bear of a man with fleshy jowls, a bulbous nose, and a sloppy comb-over, Smith could feel the stares as he lumbered down the center aisle, then jostled through the hushed standing-room crowd to the exit. "Excuse me. Excuse me." Smith's abrupt departure looked like one of his unorthodox protests, like the time he brandished a plastic fetus on the Senate floor, or the time he announced he was resigning from the Republican Party because it was cutting too many big government deals with the Democrats. Smith was an unabashed ideologue, rated the most conservative and the most frugal senator by various right-wing interest groups. He had voted against food stamps and Head Start, clamored for President Bill Clinton's impeachment, and even mounted his own quixotic campaign for president on a traditional values platform. But this was no protest. Smith was rushing to the White House to celebrate a big government deal with the Democrats. At the height of the partisan war over the Florida recount, President Clinton was signing a bipartisan bill to revive the Florida Everglades, a $7.8 billion rescue mission for 69 endangered species and 20 national parks and refuges. It was the largest environmental restoration project in the history of the planet, and Smith had pushed it through Congress with classic liberal rhetoric, dismissing its price tag as just a can of Coke per citizen per day, beseeching his colleagues to save this treasure as our legacy to our children and grandchildren. So after his dash from the court, he headed straight to the cabinet room, where he exchanged congratulations with some of the Democratic Party's top environmentalists, like Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt, the former head of the League of Conservation Voters, and White House aide George Frampton, the former head of the Wilderness Society. And Smith was not even the most surprising guest in the West Wing that day. That was Florida's Republican governor, another key supporter of the Everglades plan, a former Miami developer named Jeb Bush. As the world waited to hear whether his brother would win his state and succeed their father's successor in the White House, Jeb was already there, staring out at the rose garden with the air of a quarterback who had stumbled into the opposing locker room near the end of the Super Bowl. "The last time I was here, your father was president," one lobbyist told him. Jeb tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. One Clinton appointee began babbling about the Cuban Missile Crisis, possibly the last time that room had felt that tense. Jeb even said hi to a Miami congresswoman who had publicly accused him of suppressing black votes. This, thought Jeb's top environmental aide, is as surreal as politics can get. Unless, that is, but no. Vice President Gore, a key architect of the Everglades plan, stayed home to listen to the Supreme Court audio tape. "I was really proud of what we accomplished in the Everglades," Gore later recalled. "But I was at a pretty pitched battle that day." At 1:12 p.m., an ebullient President Clinton invited everyone into the Oval Office, the room that George W. Bush liked to say needed a good scrubbing. If the president was upset about Gore's plight, or Jeb's presence, or the legacy of impeachment, or his imminent move to the New York suburbs, the legendary compartmentalizer hit it well. "This is a great day," he said. "We should all be very proud." He used 18 ceremonial pens to sign the bill, graciously handing the first souvenir to Jeb. Senator Smith quipped that it was lucky Clinton's name wasn't Cornelius Snickelfritzer, or else the ceremony might never end. The president threw his head back and laughed. "Wow," thought his chief of staff, John Podesta. "This is like a Fellini movie." If Florida's political swamp was tearing Americans apart, Florida's actual swamp had a knack for bringing people together. The same Congress that had been torn in half by Clinton's impeachment had overwhelmingly approved his plan for the Everglades, after lobbyists for the sugar industry and the Audubon Society walked the corridors of Capitol Hill arm in arm. The same Florida legislature that was in turmoil over Bush v. Gore had approved Everglades restoration without a single dissenting vote. At a press conference after the ceremony, Jeb sidestepped the inevitable Bush v. Gore questions to highlight this unity. In a time when people are focused on politics, and there's a little acrimony, I don't know if y'all have noticed, this is a good example of how, in spite of all that, bipartisanship is still alive. Reporters shouted follow-ups about the court, but the governor cut them off with a smile. No. You're going the wrong way on that one. We're here to talk about something that's going to be long-lasting, way past counting votes. This is the restoration of a treasure for our country. The test. Today, everyone agrees that the Everglades is a national treasure. It's a World Heritage Site, an international biosphere reserve, the most famous wetland on Earth. It's a cultural icon, featured in Carl Hiaasen novels, Spider-Man comics, country songs, and the opening credits of CSI Miami, as well as the popular postcards of its shovel-faced alligators and spindly-legged wading birds. It's the ecological equivalent of motherhood and apple pie. When an aide on NBC's The West Wing was asked the most popular thing the president could do for the environment, he immediately replied, "Save the Everglades." But there was once just as broad a national consensus that the Everglades was a worthless morass, an enemy of civilization, an obstacle to progress. The first government report on the Everglades deemed it suitable only for the haunt of noxious vermin, or the resort of pestilential reptiles. Its explorers almost uniformly described it as a muddy, mushy, inhospitable expanse of razor-edged sawgrass in shallow water, too wet to farm, too dry to sail, too unpredictable to settle. Americans believed it was their destiny to drain this God-forsaken swamp, to reclaim it from mosquitoes and rattlesnakes, to improve it into a subtropical paradise of bountiful crops and booming communities. Wetlands were considered wastelands, and draining the swamp was a metaphor for solving festering problems. The heart of the Everglades was technically a marsh, not a swamp, because its primary vegetation was grassy, not woody. The first journalist to slog through the Everglades called it a vast and useless marsh. But it was usually described as a dismal, impenetrable swamp, and even conservationists dreamed of draining it. Converting wetland into productive land was considered the essence of conservation. Hadn't God specifically instructed man to subdue the earth, and take dominion over all the living creatures that moveth upon it? Wasn't America destined to overpower its wilderness? This is the story of the Everglades. From useless bog to national treasure. From its creation to its destruction to its potential resurrection. It is the story of a remarkable swath of real estate and the remarkable people it has attracted. From the aboriginals who created the continent's first permanent settlement in the Everglades, to the U.S. soldiers who fought a futile war of ethnic cleansing in the Everglades, to the dreamers and schemers who have tried to settle, drain, tame, develop, sell, preserve, and restore the Everglades. It's a story about the pursuit of paradise and the ideal of progress, which once inspired the degradation of nature and now inspires its restoration. It's a story about hubris and unintended consequences, about the mistakes man has made in his relationship with nature and his unprecedented efforts to fix them. The story begins with the natural Everglades ecosystem, which covered most of South Florida, from present-day Orlando all the way down to the Florida Keys. For most of its history, it was virtually uninhabited. As late as 1897, 4 years after the historian Frederick Jackson Turner declared the western frontier closed, an explorer marveled that the Everglades was still as much unknown to the white man as the heart of Africa. But once white men got to know it, they began to transform it. A Gilded Age industrialist named Hamilton Diston was the first visionary to try to drain the swamp. A brilliant oil man turned developer named Henry Flagler considered his own assault on the Everglades while he was laying the foundation for modern South Florida. And an energetic progressive-era governor named Napoleon Bonaparte Broward vowed to create an empire of the Everglades with more canals, declaring war on South Florida's water. The Everglades turned out to be a resilient enemy, resisting man's drainage schemes for decades, taking revenge in the form of brutal droughts and catastrophic floods, converting Florida swampland into an enduring real estate punchline. In 1928, a hurricane blasted Lake Okeechobee through its flimsy muck dike and drowned 2,500 people in the Everglades, a ghastly foreshadowing of Hurricane Katrina's assault on New Orleans. Mother Nature did not take kindly to man's attempts to subjugate her. But the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the ground troops in America's war against nature, finally conquered the Everglades with one of the most elaborate water control projects in history, setting the stage for South Florida's spectacular post-war development. Suburbs such as Weston, Wellington, Plantation, Pembroke Pines, Miami Lakes, and Miami Springs all sprouted and drained Everglades wetlands. So did Miami International Airport, Sawgrass Mills Mall, Florida International University, Burger King corporate headquarters, and a vast agricultural empire that produces 1 out of every 5 teaspoons of American sugar. Disney World was built near the headwaters of the Everglades, and some people began to wonder whether the creation of a man-made paradise across Florida's southern thumb was worth the destruction of a natural one. So the story of the Everglades is also the story of the transformation of South Florida. From a virtually uninhabited wasteland to a densely populated fantasy land with 7 million residents, 40 million annual tourists, and the world's largest concentration of golf courses. There has never been a more grossly exaggerated region, a more grossly misrepresented region, or one concerning which less has been known than this mighty empire of South Florida, the Palm Beach Post said in 1924. That's still about right. America's war on nature has left a tattered battlefield in South Florida. Half the Everglades is gone. The other half is an ecological mess. Wading birds no longer darken the skies above it. Algal blooms are exploding in its lakes and estuaries, massacring its dolphins, oysters, and manatees. And it is now clear that the degradation extends beyond noxious vermin and pestilential reptiles, affecting the people of South Florida as well. The aquifers that store their drinking water are under siege. Their paradise has been sullied by sprawl and by overcrowded schools, hospitals, and highways. Most of them are at risk from the next killer hurricane, and the one after that. It is now almost universally agreed that South Florida's growth is no longer sustainable. The Everglades restoration plan that President Clinton signed with Governor Bush at his side is supposed to restore some semblance of the original ecosystem and guide South Florida towards sustainability. And the Army Corps of Engineers, after decades of helping to destroy the Everglades, will lead the effort to undo some of the damage. The Everglades is a test, one environmentalist has written. If we pass, we may get to keep the planet. On that December day at the millennium's end, Republicans and Democrats described Everglades restoration as the dawn of a new era in conservation, not only for South Florida, but for mankind. Instead of taming rivers, irrigating deserts, and draining swamps, man would restore ravaged ecosystems. Instead of fighting over scarce fresh water, the oil of the 21st century, Floridians would demonstrate how to share. The Everglades, Jeb Bush said, would be a model for the world, proof that man and nature could live in harmony. America's politicians would finally pass the Everglades test. It was a noble sentiment, but man had been flunking that test for a long time. Part 1. The Natural Everglades. 1. Grassy water. There are no other Everglades in the world. South Florida author Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. The place looked wild and lonely. The natural Everglades was not quite land and not quite water, but a soggy confusion of the two. It was a vast sheet of shallow water, spread across a seemingly infinite prairie of serrated sawgrass, a liquid expanse of muted greens and browns extending to the horizon. It had the panoramic sweep of a desert, except flooded, or a tundra, except melted, or a wheat field, except wild. It was studded with green teardrop-shaped islands of tangled trees and scraggly shrubs, and specked with white spider lilies and violet-blue pickerel weeds. But mostly it looked like the world's largest and grassiest puddle, or the flattest and wettest meadow, or the widest and slowest moving stream. It had the squish and the scruff of an untended yard after a downpour, except that this yard was larger than Connecticut. It wasn't obviously beautiful, but it was obviously unique. No country that I have ever heard of bears any resemblance to it, wrote one of the U.S. soldiers who hunted Seminole Indians in the Everglades in the 19th century. It seems like a vast sea, filled with grass and green trees. The Everglades seeped all the way down Florida's southern thumb, from the giant wellspring of Lake Okeechobee in the center of the peninsula, to the ragged mangrove fringes of Florida Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. A sodden savanna more than 100 miles long and as much as 60 miles wide. Just grass and water, water and grass, except for the tree islands and wildflowers that dotted the grass, and the lily pads and algal mats that floated on the water. The Seminoles called it Paheoki, or grassy water. The American soldiers who trudged through it during the Seminole Wars described it as a grassy lake, a grassy sea, an ocean of grass. The bard of the Everglades, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, later dubbed it the River of Grass. Sawgrass is actually a sedge, not a grass, but the nickname stuck. The Everglades was relentlessly, remarkably, almost perfectly flat. No majestic canyons, rugged cliffs, or rolling hills. No glaciers, geysers, or craters. Even Everglades National Park's first superintendent admitted that its landscape lacked a certain flair, calling it a study in halftones, not bright, broad strokes of a full brush, summarizing its attractions as lonely distances, intricate and monotonous waterways, birds, sky, and water. The Everglades was also an incomparably tough slog. It lacked shade and shelter, high ground and dry ground. Breathing its heavy air felt like sucking on cotton. Wading through its hip-deep muck felt like marching in quicksand. Penetrating its dense thickets of sharp-toothed sawgrass felt like bathing in broken glass. And there was something downright spooky about the place, with its bellowing alligators, grunting pig frogs, and screeching owls, and especially its eerie silences. The place looked wild and lonely, one hunter wrote after an 1885 expedition through the Everglades. About 3 o'clock it seemed to get on Henry's nerves, and we saw that he was crying. He would not tell us why. He was just plain scared. The Everglades also teemed with rats, roaches, snakes, scorpions, spiders, worms, deer flies, sand flies, and unfathomably thick clouds of bloodthirsty mosquitoes that flew up nostrils and down throats and into ears. The pioneer Miami naturalist, Charles Torrey Simpson, loved the Everglades like a son, but he readily acknowledged that the wilds of lower Florida can furnish as much laceration and as many annoyances to the square inch as any place I have ever seen. My advice is to urge every discontented man to take a trip through the Everglades, another explorer wrote. If it doesn't kill him, it will certainly cure him. But the Everglades was more than a river of grass, and it contained more than swarming bugs, slithering reptiles, and lacerating annoyances. The river of grass was only the most distinctive link of an interconnected ecosystem that once blanketed almost all of South Florida, from its headwaters atop the Kissimmee chain of lakes near modern-day Orlando, down to the coral reefs off the Keys, an area twice the size of New Jersey. The ecosystem was a watery labyrinth of lakes and lagoons, creeks and ponds, pine flatwoods and hardwood hammocks. It encompassed Biscayne Bay and Florida Bay, the St. Lucie and Miami rivers, and in addition to its extensive marshlands, it included genuine swamps, most notably the Big Cypress Swamp, a Delaware-sized mosaic of pinelands, prairies, and black water bogs, just west of the Sawgrass Everglades. Sawgrass could be as uninviting to wildlife as it was to people, but the diverse habitats of the broader Everglades ecosystem, also known as the Kissimmee-Okeechobee Everglades or South Florida ecosystem, supported an astonishing variety of life, from black bears to barracudas, turkey vultures to vase sponges, zebra butterflies to fuzzy-wuzzy air plants that looked like hairy psychedelic squid. The Everglades had prehistoric-looking wood storks that snapped their beaks shut in 3 milliseconds, sausage-shaped manatees that devoured 100 pounds of plants a day, mullet that ran in schools 3 miles long, and 4-foot-tall dwarf cypress trees that looked like skeletal bonsai. The Everglades was the only place on Earth where alligators, broad snout, fresh water, darker skin, and crocodiles, pointy snout, salt water, toothy grin, lived side by side. It was the only home of the Everglades mink, Okeechobee gourd, and big cypress fox squirrel. It had carnivorous plants, amphibious birds, oysters that grew on trees, cacti that grew in water, lizards that changed colors, and fish that changed genders. It had 1,100 species of trees and plants, 350 birds, and 52 varieties of porcelain-smooth, candy-striped tree snails. It had bottlenose dolphins, marsh rabbits, ghost orchids, moray eels, bald eagles, and countless other species that didn't seem to belong on the same continent, much less in the same ecosystem. "It is a region so different that it hardly seems to belong to the United States," said the forester Gifford Pinchot, a founding father of American conservationism. "It is full of the most vivid and most interesting life on land, in the air and in the water. It is a land of strangeness, separate and apart from the common things we all know so well." For all its mystery and monotony, the Everglades ecosystem did have a few awesome attractions. Charles Torrey Simpson was enthralled by its 100-foot-tall royal palms, with trunks like cement pillars, standing guard over its golden ocean of sedge and stream. It is a picture of unsurpassed beauty set in a wonderful frame. The whole effect is glorious beyond the power of description. Another visitor adored its profusion of wild orchids. Specimens colorless and full of color, scentless, and filled with odor that made the surrounding air heavy with their fragrance. Some garbed somberly as a Quakeress, others costumed to rival the Queen of Sheba. Early explorers were mesmerized by the millions of ibis, egrets, herons, storks, and other wading birds that seemed to darken the skies. The legendary artist and naturalist John J. Audubon nearly swooned after watching a flock of hot pink flamingos soar over the Everglades. Ah, reader, could you but know the emotion that then agitated my breast, I thought I had now reached the height of my experience. The celebrated zoologist Louis Agassiz was just as fascinated by the luminous coral reefs at the ecosystem's edge, the only living reefs in North America. Even a brief description of the immense number of shells, worms, crabs, lobsters, shrimps, crawfishes, and fishes seen everywhere upon the reef would be out of place here. In variety, in brilliance of color, in elegance of movement, the fishes may well compare with the most beautiful assemblage of birds. For the most part, though, the Everglades was less about beauty than subtlety and originality. It was less ooh or ah than It was a dainty purple gallinule tiptoeing across a lily pad in a pre-dawn mist, or a vast swath of sawgrass arching in the breeze, like a congregation at prayer. It was the vines of a strangler fig, slowly choking the life out of a cabbage palm, or a split-tailed, red-eyed hawk called the Everglades snail kite, scanning a marsh for the apple snails that made up its entire diet. Everglades vistas seemed to shift like a kaleidoscope, with subtle changes in the light or the weather. Guidebooks still warn tourists that the Everglades take some getting used to, that it reveals its secrets slowly, that its appeal may escape many visitors at first glance. There was always more to the Everglades than met the eye. Take the golden-brown Everglades goop, known as peripheton. It was easy to overlook, clumped around aquatic plants like slimy oatmeal sweaters, floating in sloughs like discolored papier-mâché, crumbling into a snowy powder during droughts. But it was the dominant life form in much of the Everglades, measured by biomass. It was also the base of the Everglades food chain, providing grazing pastures for small fish, prawns, insects, and snails, which became prey for larger fish and birds. Today, microscopes reveal peripheton mats as action-packed worlds unto themselves.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?